In the spring of 2014, a shopper walked into a garden center, found the tag promising the flower would attract bees and butterflies, and bought it for that exact reason: to help. That same flower, in many cases, carried inside its leaves and its pollen one of the insecticides most closely tied to the collapse of bee populations worldwide. In late June, scientists put a number on it. Of 71 bee-friendly plants bought from the largest garden retailers in the United States and Canada, 36 contained those insecticides. 51%. Some at doses high enough to kill a bee outright. Nobody buying them was told. To understand why that matters, start with the bee itself. Bees and other pollinators are responsible for roughly 1 out of every 3 bites of food a person eats. Over the last 2 decades, beekeepers across the United States have reported losing somewhere between 40 and 90% of their colonies in their worst years. Around 2006, beekeepers began opening hives to find them nearly empty, the workers simply gone, a pattern researchers named colony collapse disorder. The United Nations has estimated that 40% of the world's invertebrate pollinators, a group that includes bees and butterflies, are at risk of extinction. That news turned bee decline from a niche worry into a national story, and it is the backdrop against which millions of people started planting flowers on purpose to help. That awareness is exactly why the bee-friendly label exists. Walk through the outdoor section of almost any large home improvement store, and you will see flowering plants marked with a small icon of a bee, sold on the promise that planting them helps. Lavender, marigolds, asters, daisies, primrose. A person who buys a tray of them believes they are building a small refuge in their backyard. For many of these plants, the science showed they were building the opposite, and they had no way to know it. The insecticides at the center of this carry the name neonicotinoids, neonics for short. They are the most widely used class of insecticide in the world, and the way they work is not obvious. The first warning came in August of 2013, when the nonprofit Friends of the Earth and the Pesticide Research Institute ran a small pilot test on common garden plants bought from major retailers. 54% of the samples they tested contained neonics. That was the first study of its kind, so the 2 groups expanded it. In the summer of 2014, they released the larger version, titled Gardeners Beware. This time they walked into stores as ordinary customers, bought 71 plants from top garden retailers across 18 cities in the United States and Canada, and shipped them to a laboratory. 36 came back positive. The laboratory did not just check whether a chemical was present. It measured how much and where inside the plant it had settled. Some of the flowers carried neonic levels high enough that, assuming the same concentration reached the pollen and nectar, a visiting bee could be killed outright. Of the contaminated plants, 40% contained not 1 neonic, but 2 or more. The flowers were the same ones being marketed to safe pollinators, sitting on the same shelves, under the same bee-friendly signs. One member of Congress later described selling those plants without disclosure as an unfair and deceptive practice, and the plants themselves looked perfectly healthy. There was no wilting, no warning, nothing on the leaf to suggest anything was wrong. The 2014 study also examined where the chemical concentrated and found neonics present in the flowers, the exact part of the plant a bee feeds from. What separates a neonic from an ordinary pesticide is one word: systemic. A surface spray sits on the outside of a leaf, where rain and washing can take it away. A systemic insecticide is absorbed by the plant and carried through all of its living tissue. It moves into the stems, the leaves, the pollen, and the nectar. You cannot rinse it off because it is not resting on the plant. It is inside the plant, and it does not break down quickly, which means a single treated flower can stay toxic to insects for months, and in some cases for years. Picture how a bee actually meets the chemical. It lands on a bright flower in a backyard garden, drinks the nectar, gathers the pollen, and carries both back to the colony. If that flower grew from a treated plant, the bee gathers the poison along with the food, then carries it home and feeds it to the next generation in the hive. There are 6 of these chemicals a gardener is most likely to meet: imidacloprid, clothianidin, thiamethoxam, thiacloprid, dinotefuran, and acetamiprid. At high concentrations, neonics kill bees directly, and they have been linked to several large, visible bee die-offs. The harder part to see is what happens at low concentrations. A group of independent scientists known as the Task Force on Systemic Pesticides reviewed roughly 800 peer-reviewed studies. They concluded that even below the dose that kills, neonics impair a bee's ability to reproduce, to learn, to remember, to navigate back to its hive, and to fight off disease. One peer-reviewed study found that American agriculture has become about 48 times more toxic to insects since neonics came into wide use in the 1990s. The European Union banned its 3 most common neonics on the strength of evidence like this. The United States Environmental Protection Agency moved far more slowly. It is worth asking why these chemicals were on garden flowers at all. On farms, neonics are sprayed across enormous acreage and coated onto the seeds of major crops. On ornamental garden plants, the reason was often simpler and harder to defend. They kept the flowers looking flawless on the shelf, free of the small leaf damage a shopper might walk past. Much of the treatment existed for appearance, so the plant would sell. This is the point where the story stops being only about a chemical and becomes a story about the people who bought the plants. After the first reports spread, more than 500,000 Americans signed petitions demanding that Home Depot and Lowe's stop selling plants treated with neonics. The campaign had a name: Bee Action, and it did not stay online. People delivered letters to store managers, made phone calls, and turned up in the garden aisles of Home Depot and Lowe's in person. Large investors joined in, with asset managers pressing the companies in private meetings to disclose their progress. A wholesale chain called BJ's was among the first to answer, telling its suppliers to remove the chemicals or label them by the end of 2014. Then, the giants moved. In the fall of 2014, Home Depot, the largest home improvement chain on earth, began requiring its suppliers to label every plant treated with neonics and committed to finding alternatives. In April of 2015, Lowe's announced it would phase the chemicals out over 4 years. By the end of 2015, Home Depot reported it had already pulled neonics from 80% of its flowering plants, with a goal of finishing by 2018. The industry did not all agree. Trade groups for professional growers argued that neonics, used as directed, were not the real cause of bee decline. The pressure kept traveling up the supply chain anyway. In a 2016 industry survey, 74% of the growers who supply those big chains said they would not use neonics that year. A campaign that started with shoppers reading the fine print on plant tags had begun to reshape what the largest growers in the country were willing to produce. 2 years after the first major study, the same scientists went back and tested again. In August of 2016, they published the follow-up. The share of plants contaminated at harmful levels had fallen from 51% to 23%. The drop lined up almost exactly with the retailer commitments working their way through suppliers. The 2016 report also flagged a newer concern: finding that flowering trees used to line city streets and business parks were frequently treated, which made them a quiet source of exposure for urban bees. At the time of that report, a few chains, including Ace Hardware and True Value, had not yet made company-wide commitments, though many of their stores would shift later. A public opinion poll taken that year found that 67% of Americans felt more positive about Home Depot because of its pledge, and 66% felt the same about Lowe's. Home Depot finished eliminating neonics from its live plants by 2019, and later reported that 98% of its plants in the United States were neonic-free. In total, more than 140 companies, including Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart, True Value, and Costco, committed to removing neonics from their plant supply chains. Years later, the federal posture began to shift as well. The Environmental Protection Agency placed a moratorium on new and expanded neonic uses, and a federal appeals court overturned the approval of another bee-toxic insecticide entirely. That is the honest shape of this story. The problem was real, and public pressure genuinely shrank it. It did not erase it, and it was never a secret that is still being kept today. The part that is easy to exaggerate is just as important to state plainly. The plants are not guaranteed clean. A bee-friendly label still does not certify that a plant was grown without neonics, and it is still possible to walk out of a store with a treated one. The chemicals remain the most widely used insecticides on the planet, mostly through farming rather than garden centers. And the United States still has not matched the European Union's restrictions. For a shopper standing in the aisle, the practical takeaway is mixed. The odds that any given plant is contaminated are far lower than they were in 2014, but they are not zero. So if you garden and you want the flowers you plant to actually do what the tag promises, there are a few steps that hold up. Buy plants grown from certified organic starts, or grow your own from untreated seed in organic soil, because organic certification does not permit neonics. When you buy any pest control product, look for the letters OMRI on the label, which mark it as approved for organic use, and check the active ingredients against those 6 neonic names. Ask the nursery directly how their plants were grown. A staff member who genuinely cannot answer is itself a kind of answer. There is one more tool worth knowing about. Friends of the Earth publishes a retailer scorecard that grades major grocery and garden chains on how far they have gone to keep pollinator toxic pesticides out of their products. And it is a faster way to judge a store than reading every tag inside it. The reason the label alone was never enough is the same reason the original problem stayed invisible for so long. The poison was never something a buyer could see on the plant. It was inside it, in the exact part of the flower the bee was meant to feed on. The bees never got a vote in any of this. The people who planted flowers for them did. And that turned out to be enough to move the largest retailers in the world. If you want more stories like this one, where a quiet problem hiding on an ordinary shelf finally gets pulled apart and explained, subscribe, and the next one will be ready when you are.